Right. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to this Silver Society Sunday lecture. I'm Lucy Morton, and I'm editor of Silver Studies, the Silver Society Journal. We are, of course, very pleased to greet all members of the Silver Society who have joined us, but we're particularly pleased to be able to welcome members of other societies and groups, including the Society of Jewellery Historians, the Society of the History of Collecting, the Attingham Trust, the Furniture History Society, the English Ceramic Circle, Contemporary British Silversmiths, Goldsmiths Centre and the Goldsmiths Company, as well as silversmiths, museum curators, independent scholars and other silver enthusiasts. Just to remind you, after this lecture you can switch channels, so to speak, and tune into the Furniture History Society's first online event. At 7 o'clock this evening, Dr. Diana Davis will be talking on Raiding the Past, Furniture for the Anglo-Gallic Interior, 1800 to 1865. And this is a look at the role of the dealer cabinet makers, such as Edward Holmes Baldock and Robert Hume, and their role in creating and modifying Ancien Régime furniture and directing the tastes of their clientele. If you want to join this, contact quickly events@furniturehistorysociety.org now if you want to sign up details. This evening's talk will run for about just under an hour, and there will be questions at the end once Gareth has finished speaking. If you have a question, please will you type it in using the chat button at the bottom of the Zoom screen, and then I'll sort of mediate and Gareth will answer the questions. We've muted everyone apart from myself and Gareth, but please can you make quite sure that your microphones are off, because we have found in the past there was some interference. We hope, of course, you will enjoy this lecture and that it may make you want to consider joining the Silver Society. You can find out more about us from our website, www.
Lucy, sorry, I think you're on mute. Can you just...
Good. Sorry.
Yep, here we go.
Sorry.
Just the introduction about Gareth.
Just the last bit.
Yeah, the introduction about Gareth. Sorry, everyone.
We're delighted that Gareth Harris of Smith & Harris has agreed to give us the lecture this evening that he originally gave to the Silver Society in 2018, and which unfortunately was not recorded at the time. And it is exciting that, thanks to this somewhat scary technology, fingers crossed that everything works, we can reach so many more of you. Gareth will be well known to many of you as one of the country's leading contemporary goldsmiths. He attended a pre-apprentice course at the Sir John Cass School of Art and served his apprenticeship at Paget and Braham, where he was taught by Victor de Bossart, a descendant of French Huguenots, a wonderful illustration of the long silversmithing traditions which have played such a significant part in the development of his career. Gareth went on to work for Edward Barnard & Son, a long-established company whose archive is now in the V&A Archive of Art and Design. This is where he met his future business partner, Dennis Smith, who had studied for a diploma in silversmithing and jewellery at the Cass, and was at the time house designer for Barnard's. In 1981, Gareth and Dennis took on their present premises at 31 Hatton Garden, at the heart of the District of London, specialising in working in gold, silver and precious stones. The workshop they took over had been used by silversmiths for over 200 years. It was previously occupied by R. Hod & Son, a name which is not generally well known, but they were significant suppliers to the retail trade and the hotel and restaurant trades, and exhibited at the Great Exhibition of 1851. Pod, in turn, had taken over the premises from John Edward Terry, who in 1814 went into partnership with Samuel Hennell of the famous family of silversmiths dating back to the early 18th century. When Gareth and Dennis took over the workshop, all the drop presses and dies were still in the workshop, although they had not been in use since the 1970s. This continuity of occupations spanning the 21st century back to the early 19th century is extraordinary. I find it intensely moving. And it is amazing to think that people are still plying their craft in this space and using tools that would have been completely familiar to craftsmen in the 18th century. Gareth and Dennis had barely taken over the premises and were still setting up their workshop when their first important commission arrived, supplying diplomatic gifts for Margaret Thatcher, the then Prime Minister. In the intervening period, the two have moved from working as a specialist trade workshop, supplying retailers and other silversmiths, to being designer craftsmen in their own right. And they now have an international client base, including De Beers and Microsoft. And they have designed and made pieces for Oxford colleges, military regiments, and city livery companies as well. As mentioned above, many of the techniques they use would have been recognizable to craftsmen in the past, but they have also pushed forward, working with CAD, computer-aided design. In 2009, they made a cup commissioned by Nigel Israel, which presented its own unique problems. It was made from palladium and was the first piece to bear the newly instituted hallmark for this metal. When I talked to Gareth last week, he said that they have always prided themselves in taking on challenges that were well beyond the ordinary. And I will now hand over to him to give you an extraordinary and vivid insight into what two of these projects have entailed. Thank you, Gareth.
Well, good evening, everybody. Hello. Welcome. It's lovely to have everybody here, seeing all these names. Pindar, this quote, neither moth nor rust devour it, but the mind of man is devoured, is very true. Pindar certainly got this right. Very few people have the pleasure of and privilege of working in gold. It's an extraordinary material, rare, it's highly malleable, it's an extremely strong metal. I'll talk about that later, and it's beautiful. But it's a difficult metal to work. And this talk came about because I was asked the question by Tim Schroeder, a past Prime Warden of Goldsmiths Company, who was researching his book that he spoke about at this last talk, and asked me why it was that in the 16th century, clients paid so much more for a similar article in silver when they commissioned it in gold. And my response was that it's just more difficult. And this talk really came about as a way of demonstrating that. So what I'm going to talk about are two commissions that Smith and Harris made 10 years apart. In 2008, we were approached by Mark Quinn and asked if we could make a life-size gold sculpture of Kate Moss. And in 2018, we were approached by Microsoft to ask if we could make a hand of bananas that acted as a hand of bananas and can be torn one from the other and replaced. And so that's what I'll be touching on this evening. If I can get my slideshow to work, one moment. We'll get there. I have help. There. So what you can see on the screen there are two strawberries by Mark Quinn. We were introduced to him by Louisa Guinness, who runs the Louisa Guinness Gallery. And he was visiting our workshop regularly. What we do for Louisa is discover how miniature pieces of jewellery can be made from existing works of art by contemporary artists. Nestling in behind that white gold and yellow gold strawberry, you can see a water ring by Anish Kapoor. And generally the artists come and see us and we discuss something that might be suitable. And this was the first job that we made for Mark Quinn, were these frozen strawberries, which were part of a larger work of art that he had made, where he froze a great deal of flowers and fruits. And it was while he was in the workshop one day and we were having a cup of tea, he turned to us and said, "So just how large can you two work?" And as it so happened, he was standing exactly over the spot where we'd cast the hull of a boat in lead shortly before that. So we suggested that we were open to any challenge. And so he asked us if we would give him a ballpark figure for how much it would cost to make a life-size sculpture of Kate Moss. To our shame, I don't think we took him terribly seriously at first. And it was only when he nudged us a couple of times and Dennis turned to me and said, "You know what, I think he's actually serious about this," that we started work in earnest. This was to be the result. The brief was that she had to weigh exactly 50 kilos, which I've always taken to be her body weight. We were very fortunate. We managed to get a body cast of her, and Dennis worked out her entire surface area. Working back from that to an average depth of 2.5 to 3 millimeters, Dennis was able to calculate a finished weight. We worked out a budget and presented it to Mark. It was an extremely fraught meeting. It was almost as though the four walls of the workshop somehow couldn't contain the expectations and the trust necessary for this sheer amount of money. We realized that in order for the sculpture to all be a uniform color, we would need to buy all the gold at once. So it wasn't as though we could slowly make it up, buying gold month by month. We were looking for an enormous upfront payment to cover materials. And unable to make a decision, Mark and I took to the streets of Clerkenwell and paced about, each pouring out our various worries and concerns and issues. And at a certain point on the Farringdon Road, Mark stopped on a corner and turned to me and said, "Right, we're going to do this. I'm going back to my workshop, my studio. I'm going to transfer a sum, was roughly £1 million to you. Please don't let me hear on Monday that you're in South America." So where do you start? Having worked out the surface area, we realized that we needed 67 kilos of gold, we needed 67 kilos in total to achieve the 50 kilo target. That's because when you cast in gold or cast in any metal, you need a significant extra amount of metal to create the push and the force of metal as we use the process lost wax casting. Here's an image to the right. That's part of the full-sized mold, and to the left we've got Kate Moss's face. The mold was made by a tremendous technician called Steve Haynes, a wonderful sculptor in his own right. He had the privilege of body casting Kate Moss in this extraordinary yoga position known as the siren. And as it turned out, Kate Moss's bikini didn't take to the mold, it stuck to it. So it had to be substituted by one of Steve's daughter's bikinis. We entrusted this, the making of the wax, to BAC Casters in Clerkenwell, a firm within walking distance of ourselves, who we've had a relationship with. Actually, before the two current people who run it, we had a relationship with their father. So a long relationship of trust, and they created the waxes, which were then cut up into 40 different pieces. And here are some of the first. That's a knee joint to the right. You'll see this reappear later on, fully formed in gold. And then to the left, we've got a foot, another knee, and part of a forearm. Now, the lost wax process is rather like fossilization, only it's done very much faster. You're taking an original object, making a mold of it. That's in an extremely fine plaster that we know of as investment plaster. When that mold is dry, that object is taken out, leaving a void, in the way with fossilization that the original host object would just deteriorate until it no longer existed. And into that space is poured wax. Those waxes there, let's take that foot, is sitting on a tree, as it's known, and those bars we know as sprues, and it's sitting on a cone. All that you see there in wax will be transformed into gold, and that large cone of wax acts as a sort of reservoir to keep the pressure of the molten metal pouring into the mold, to prevent it coming back and to prevent a weight, so that every fine piece of detail on those waxes is reproduced. Mold making is an extraordinary skill. When I attended casting classes at Sir John Cass, they were for the first time using induction casting and vacuum pumping to get bubbles out of molds. And I remember being told by the person that taught me that it was now possible to make a fingerprint on something like a glass, and for a mold of that to be taken, and for the fingerprint to be reproduced in the finished casting. So all Kate Moss's fingerprints and toe prints and wrinkles were all faithfully reproduced in these waxes. To the right hand side, the knee piece, you can see that there are some very fine stainless steel wires running up through that hollow knee. They hold the core, the plaster core, in place when that wax is melted out, so that when the high pressure and molten gold is poured in, that core doesn't move. If it were to move, you've got a disaster and you'd no longer be able to use the casting. So from wax, or another wax here, there you can see to the left, the foot. There's no special reason that it's in two separate colors. That was just the wax that was available in the workshop. But you can see there that's been joined up from two halves. You can again see the stainless steel wires to hold the core in place. And then the very fine wax sprues are airways. They're to let air out as the molten gold is poured in. To the right-hand side, that's Russell Delahaye, expert mold maker. There were many parts from the original mold that we had to subsequently remold because we needed everything to be hollow. There could be nothing solid. So whereas the hair had originally been cast solid and modeled solid, molds had to be taken yet again of that. And that's a section of hair that you can see the blue wax on the desk to the right of the white mold. That white material is a rubber, a low temperature setting rubber, room temperature it sets at, fantastic for getting incredible detail. That's the other half of it you can see further above it. And this extraordinary series of cuts is done intentionally so that when the two halves of that mold are reunited without anything inside it, everything aligns perfectly so that things are in the correct place. And here are the first castings. There you can see those heavy cones and trees are now gold. The wax has been lost. That's how it gets its name. The wax is melted out of the mold and replaced with the gold. And there we are, faced with in some cases there, you're looking up inside the neck to the right-hand side, this incredible tree of sprues. The more sprues you apply, the better feed of metal to the object that you're casting, the more likely you're to get it all out and in better detail. But you then give yourself greater problems in actually cutting and getting those sprues out. Now, the hacksaw is not the first tool that comes to mind when you imagine a goldsmith working. But this was absolutely no normal job. We problem solved and found techniques from many other disciplines as we worked through this job. For the catalogue of the gold exhibition that was held at Goldsmiths Hall sometime after we'd finished, the then curator of the Goldsmiths Company, Rosemary Ransom Wallace, described in the catalogue entry for this piece that the manufacturing of it was akin to flying to Mars. No one else had ever done anything like this before. In antiquity, there had been large gold sculptures. In Greece, at the Parthenon, there was supposed to have been a much larger than life-sized statue of Athena. But it's likely that those huge gold Buddhas that you find in Thailand and other places are actually thin sheet gold that's been worked over either a wood or plaster or stone core. It's unlikely that many people had ever tried casting something of this size. To the right-hand side, you can see me weighing the sprues. There was endless weighing. We weighed and reweighed, constantly calculating, had we got our calculations right? Was this going to work? Was there enough metal in the budget? So there you can see almost 11 kilos of sprues. Gold is almost the ultimate recyclable material. People often ask me, what happened to these wonderful pieces from the past? Where are the tremendous pieces of gold that Henry VIII had made for the Field of the Cloth of Gold? Well, they're here. They're here with us. You're wearing them if you have a piece of gold on your being tonight. These pieces just get returned to the pot in times of trouble or times when finance is needed. So while gold is an almost indestructible material, as Pindar said, very little will destroy it. Gold objects can have a short life if they don't end up in the right place, because they can be very easily melted down. So it's 11 kilos of sprues wouldn't have gone straight back into the next casting. When gold is molten and you are transferring it from the furnace to where it's being cast, it would cool. So in order to make that transition, the gold has to be heated slightly uncomfortably past its melting point. And at that point, parts of the alloy start to vaporize away. So with every piece of recycled gold, we added about a third of newly alloyed material to make sure we wouldn't have any problems with our final castings. From the very start with this job, one of our biggest issues was security. If we were making a 50 kilo statue in silver, it would have taken a large truck, probably a team of 4 men, and a lot of work to steal it. 50 kilos of gold can be taken away in a small suitcase by one person. We had many issues to do with security. Word fairly early got out through the art world that Mark Quinn was up to something, and so we had to absolutely double down on who knew of this. We told nobody. When anybody visited our workshop, we hid it. But we knew, thinking ahead, that one of our big issues would be getting this piece hallmarked. Hallmarking is an ancient, in fact, it's the oldest continuous consumer protection device. If any of you are wearing a piece of gold, you might be familiar with the hallmarks that are inside it, these small punches that are a government-backed guarantee that what you are buying is gold. And we knew by law that we would have to take this sculpture and have it hallmarked. So we liaised with the assay office, which is where these hallmarks are applied. And we came to an agreement that we would be allowed to submit all 40 pieces, because that's what we had to cut this torso up into. 40 different pieces. We would supply all of those to the assay office, where they would all be independently tested. We also supplied all the filler rod that we used when we welded them together. And when the piece was finally finished, provided they were happy that all those pieces they had seen were there present, we would be allowed to have the objects hallmarked in our workshop. So this was the system we devised. We laid the pieces out on the floor in the parcels that we sent them to be hallmarked in. We photographed them, we numbered them, and as an added little accounting security, we included our shoes in the photographs so that we knew who had taken the photograph and who was responsible. So those are Dennis's well-polished shoes, black shoes to the left, and those are my slightly scruffier desert boots to the left. Grinding. We made tremendous technological advances, not just in welding and other things, but we discovered carbide burrs. These are an ultra sharp, ultra strong, very expensive, but wonderful mechanical burr that we were able to grind the backs of these sprues, those sticks that you saw there attached to the castings. Having hacksawed as close as we could to the casting, we were able to grind those away with carbide burrs. And we ended up with a workshop. We tried our best with this ridiculous black ground sheeting. We covered everything in it. We worked inside black tents of it with specialist little eye holes so that we could work inside it. But nevertheless, we incurred a 5% loss on that 67 kilos that we brought. 3% of that was in casting, when I explained that some of the metal vaporizes as it's being cast, and we lost 2%. So a significant loss. So once we got the castings to this shape, we knew our only way of joining them together was by welding. The only silversmith, it seemed, in the world who was welding silver at that time was Hector Miller, a fellow goldsmith, a past prime warden of Goldsmiths Company, all-round fantastic man. And he could not have been more generous in his knowledge and expertise of silver welding, though he had done no welding. But he passed us on his contacts, recommended welding equipment, and we were off experimenting with welding. So we bought a sheet of silver, cut it up into strips, and I'm appalled now looking at that image to the left of the first attempts at welding. But we eventually got there. Once those strips were all welded back into a sheet, we rolled them round into a tube, cut that up into pieces and welded that up until there was more weld than silver. On the left-hand image, that strange little gold-coloured piece was my first attempt at gold welding. That was one of the first sprues that we milled out into sheet of the same thickness as the castings and welded it together. And that's what we were seeking to achieve. Unlike soldering, which is an alloy of the metal that you're joining, which is alloyed with lower melting point ingredients, and so that metal melts before the metal that you're hoping to join, but unfortunately leaves a color difference. Welding is invisible. It's a completely different process, and it completely counterintuitive when you've spent a lifetime soldering gold together, where you are looking to get as fine a join as possible. Gold solder will not fill a gap. But with welding, it's the exact opposite. You need to make a 45-degree cut away from the pieces to be joined. We both gas welded and arc welded this together, and we filled in the arc welding, which the majority was done with, we filled that gap with exactly the same 18-karat gold from the same batch production as had produced the casting. So the beauty of welding is that once those beads are ground away, the join is invisible, completely invisible. We would often weld pieces together and then not be able to discover where we'd made the join. And we're off. Here are the first 4 pieces joined together. There will always be a small amount of distortion, often to do with the applying of the sprues or the removal of the sprues. So gentle fitting, hammering there into a tree trunk. This is an ancient process. You carve or cut small depressions into the tree trunk and can move metal down into them. And in that bottom image there, I'm spending a lot of time looking at it. We spend a lot of time looking and thinking and fitting. There you can see in the left-hand image welding taking place. The arc of an arc welder is as bright and powerful as the sun. So if you are not completely covered, you can get extremely badly burnt. So fully covered, gloves, welding mask, and in that left-hand image, you can see that black tube snaking around behind me is supplying the argon and gas and electric current to the handpiece. And then there's another wire with a clamp connected to the leg. That's the live feed. So between those, the arc is struck and the welding takes place. To the right-hand side, it's back on the workbench, endless fitting, making sure that everything on this sculpture was going to go together properly. Back to security. Our insurers really couldn't believe their ears when we described what it was we were planning to make. And we had the option to carry on the way we were at the time, but no one could leave the workshop. So we seriously thought about sleeping at the workshop while Siren was made. We estimated that it would take 6 months. Fortunately, we decided against that, and we decided to go for an all singing, all dancing alarm system, complete with panic buttons and cameras and the whole caboodle. And we bought a Chubb Financier safe, the highest rated and largest commercially available safe in which to put the pieces as it was made. And again, Dennis's calculations were such that he believed we would get her finished into the safe. It wasn't all plain sailing. This was one of the first failures. No metal actually likes to flow into a constricted space. So the thicker hair here and the thinner face meant that several parts here on the face didn't fill. So it was back to the drawing board. We weren't happy either at our ability to be able to clean up and make a beautiful join between the face and the hair. So we were actually glad that this failed, because it pushed us to discover another way of working this. And that was to separate the face from the hair. There to the left, you can see Dennis welding with a hot welding pencil a bead. It's a slightly darker blue wax around the face. This was to give us something extra to work with when that was joined in behind the hair. Beside that face that he's working on, you can see a plaster cast. We worked from plaster casts to make sure we were getting all the details correct. And then to the right, there you can just see that extra blue surround on the face. And that's on the scales, more weighing. For each cast, a very accurate weight had to be made of the wax. And from that, a precise calculation could be made as to how much gold went into the casting process for that particular piece. You obviously didn't want gold overflowing onto the floor and being lost. And there's Dennis with the new face that we were absolutely thrilled with. We were very aware that most people, when looking at any sort of sculpture like this, will naturally gravitate to the face. So we put a great deal of effort into that. There to the right, it was extraordinary. We had this sort of slightly unusual torso, but as soon as it had a face, it became human. And it was quite remarkable. I learned a lot about human anatomy working on this, and the absolute marvel of how much can exist inside a human being. There were times, there was a lot of work that was done inside the figure. We welded both outside and inside. And there were times when I was trying to get my arms up inside this torso, and just amazed that there could be so much going on inside a human body, the spine, all the organs, in this tiny space. Kate Moss had a very, very small waist. There was one amusing point. I went and did some welding training with an expert welder. We explained what we were going to do. And of course, this was so unusual. We were given their best welder, who welded underwater on North Sea oil rigs and various other things. But I never quite let on, because of security, what exactly it was I was welding up, until at some point I had a real problem and I couldn't get past it, and called this fellow. And he, of course, like so many practical people, wanted more information. And he said, "Gareth, what exactly are you doing? Describe to me exactly where you are." And I said, "Well, I'm halfway inside a life-size gold sculpture of Kate Moss," to which there was a long silence. So there to the left, you can see the head there, and half the head being added on. We realized that the face was the most vulnerable. It was the furthest extremity of the sculpture, and it was going to the one piece that was going to get damaged and knocked. And of course, everybody knows that gold is soft because it abrades away easily. It's actually an extremely hard material. Its softness is its ability to be worn away. This is Moh's scale, M-O-H's scale. And it records how easily you can abrade away a metal. So everybody knows that gold is soft. Very few people know that gold has a tensile strength. very close to that of steel. So when it came to fitting, we didn't want to grind away to make gaps fit, because that would have created a distortion in the overall figure, which we knew to be perfect from the mold. So we clamped pieces together. And you can see here how over the course of these 40 pieces, each one with tiny distortions, we sometimes ended up with gaps. Less important in the hair, but critical when we were working on the body, that we got those together. And to the right there, you can see the coil of gold filler wire draped around one of the thighs, spooling out there. And the handset for the TIG welder is inside the body. Clearly there's work going on there. And you can see to the arm that has been attached, you can see the heat that had travelled from that weld out into the gold. Fortunately, the shielding gas in TIG welding, argon, creates an atmosphere-free environment, so you get no oxidization, no staining and no marking. So once that was cleaned away, you had a perfect gold surface. I think I've just gone over two. So there to the left, you can see the knee attached to the thigh. So that knee section was the piece you saw right at the beginning in wax. There are two V-shaped notches there. That was to enable correct alignment, so we knew exactly where the pieces joined up. And on the image to the right, that little mark in the rubber tubing that's carrying, actually it's carrying more than just gas and an electric cable, it's also carrying a water cooler because the handset would get so hot otherwise. And usually you would grasp that around the handset, but in order to be able to travel and work up inside these limbs, I used to insert bamboo sticks and, well, anything I could find really to lengthen that, the length of that welding tip. And even though it's slightly foreshortened in that image, I'm welding at some considerable distance. And given that the arc will only light when you're at the absolutely correct distance from the object, that was tricky going, but a skill we mastered. I've done it again. No, it's and back and back. So here's gas welding. This is oxygen and gas. Because of that precise angle that you need when arc welding, sometimes it just wasn't possible to get into. Here I am welding around a piece of wire, a piece of hair, and it would have been impossible to have arc welded this. So at those points, old-fashioned gas welding came to the fore. In the image to the right, you can see the two halves. This was the piece of hair that was being molded at the beginning, some of those early images. So held together with clamps, thank goodness for G-clamps, and welded together in the second image. We borrowed G-clamps from virtually every discipline, engineering, woodworking, you name it. We scoured tool shops, online tool shops, second-hand shops, anything, to get ever larger and larger clamps. And to our astonishment, we were shattering some of these iron clamps with the pressure that we needed to join these pieces together. It was quite a challenge. We were endlessly checking the alloys of the gold. We were convinced that there was some additive in it that was maybe making it so hard, but it was just that sheer and unbelievable strength that gold has. And there you can see in the image to the right, sometimes the limited access was even more limited because there were so many clamps in the way. There are clamps clamped onto clamps. And sometimes we adapted clamps. We welded pieces, additions to the clamps to enable them to make the correct grip, to enable us to pull things together. So halfway through we decided it was time. We'd pushed and pulled this poor casting so hard, we felt that the metal had become work hardened, and it's a time-honored process to anneal precious metal when it becomes work hardened. You heat it up until it's just become red hot. You leave it at that temperature for as long as possible. The optimum time is actually about 20 minutes, and then you quench it. Normally, you would have a sink of water or a bucket or something to quench it in. Of course, this was too large for anything like that, so we suspended it on a scaffold pole across the workshop, suspended on chain. There's a large steel plate in the base there. You can see two bolts there holding that in place to make sure that during the heating process it didn't deform. And then at the end we quenched it with a hose pipe, hoping that most of the water would end up in the two receptacles underneath it. Of course it didn't. And there to the right, we're bailing out the swimming pool that the workshop had become. One of the greatest gifts to engineering, goldsmithing, blacksmithing, and countless other traditions is engineer's blue. You can look on the left-hand image there on the leg, painted with, it's like a thick ink in oil. It doesn't run, but you can paint it on. And by taking that leg and offering it up to the back, in the second image to the right, you can just see that a trace is left, which is then ground away. And by repeatedly doing this, by repeatedly applying the engineer's blue, touching it and making the marks, seeing where the high spots are, that can be ground away. The interesting thing about this sculpture is the tension. It's a pose where the limbs are all locked together by one arm. And it relies for its impact on that visual tension. And it was quite clear to us that it wasn't going to work until unless the fit between those limbs was absolutely right. So we spent a great deal of time on this sort of fitting to ensure everything would be in place. So that image to the right is that leg in place. And there you can see how everything, the one leg held under one arm, another leg around the arm of that, held into place by the right hand. And in that left-hand image, you can see, again, slightly foreshortened by the photography, but that clamp holding that leg in place prior to welding is almost as big as I am. We also, by this stage, had to fix the sculpture to an old surface plate, which weighed about an iron surface plate, which weighed about another 20 kilos. So we were manhandling around 70 kilos at this point. Hair. We've all become slightly more aware of our hair during lockdown. For me personally, I've always thought one of the failings in most lifelike sculpture, whether it's in metal or stone, is the hair. It somehow looks heavy and lumpen. It looks as though it's full of plaster. And we were determined that the hair would look right on this sculpture. So to that end, we started in the conventional way and set about chasing the hair. This is the use of small steel punches, which are hammered into the surface to create texture and movement. We called in specialists, we laboured at it, and we weren't happy with the result. Dennis then came up with an idea and brilliantly cut what looked like little sharp combs, and we dragged those through the hair to try and create lifelike looking hair. It was a dramatic improvement in that the hair was bright, but we had extreme difficulty getting it into problematic areas and following some of the curves. So finally, the third process was the use of very small carborundum disc burrs. And over months, we painstakingly cut this hair in hair by hair. The result was wonderful. Again, when it was put on display, usually the first comments people made were, "My goodness, isn't the hair beautiful?" So into the safe she went every night. I used to apologize to her. By this time, she had become like a small child that we manhandled around the workshop. And once we had polished her eyes, she actually could follow us around the room. So it seemed completely unkind to lock her into this terrible steel box every night. Dennis's calculations were almost exactly right. We just had to grind out a tiny space from the steel wall of the back of the safe to enable her nose to sit comfortably in the safe without fear of damaging it. The image to the right is approaching completion, the last welds to join hand to foot. The panel in the back there was left until last to enable access. And the problem of welding needing an absolute precise alignment of arc to object, and this object, which by this time was weighing well over 70 kilos, meant that we spent far more time moving it around than we actually did welding it. It became an ever more difficult object to work with. And there's the very last plate going in. People very rarely look at the backs of sculptures. I thought the back of this looked absolutely beautiful. In the right-hand image, you can just see her spine there coming through. It was a beautifully detailed piece of work. I enjoyed, I think, looking at the back as much as the front. So with that cleaned up, you can see the circles there on the right-hand side with out and out and out on it. This was so that I knew I was panel beating effectively from the inside with some long steel tools to just get the profile absolutely right before we did the final cleanup and skin texture. And there she is being hallmarked in the left-hand image in good goldsmithing technique. The goldsmith who makes it stamps their maker's mark, or sponsor's mark as it's known now, into the object. We spent quite a lot of time working out a place where it could be seen, but where nobody would immediately notice it. And so we found a fold in her bikini. There I am stamping the single punch of Smith & Harris's maker's mark into it. The man with the blue lanyard is Andy Waker, the head of the assay office in Greville Street, and he had come to stamp the official punches in following on from that maker's mark. It's unlikely that an assay office employee came out to a workshop to stamp a hallmark in, had done something like that for several hundred years. It used to be the way it was done, but I think they stopped doing it in the 17th century. So this was quite an interesting event for us. And there she was on the scales. Ever cautious to the last, she was actually ½ kilo underweight. So we melted up some of the sprues into that little gold bar that you can see. Well, it was quite a big gold bar, actually. It was a ½ kilo gold bar. Tack welded that into the underside of the sculpture. It's signed with Mark Quinn's name and the date. And there you can see it back on the scales, weighing in at absolutely exactly 50 kilos to the gram. And there she is finished. And off to Goldsmiths Hall to be unveiled to the press. We felt that Goldsmiths, who'd been so helpful, should be able to take advantage of the publicity that this generated at the time of its unveiling. and Mark Quinn very kindly allowed it to be unveiled there. In fact, we had a lunch around it, which was interesting. And Kate Moss turned up to see it for the first time. She, of course, arrived many hours late. We had been very concerned during the manufacture of it. She had wanted to come and see its progress. And at the time she was going out with a young man named Pete Doherty, who had something of a reputation as a hellraiser. We were also very concerned that there were others in the art world who, for a prank, were quite keen to make off with it. So we told Mark to tell Kate that it was being made in Switzerland under high security and that she couldn't come and see it. This was a sort of two-edged sword for us, because there were many times when I actually would have liked to have worked from her directly. Obviously, she was one of the most photographed women in the world. So there were thousands of images that we could get to work from. But the one area I couldn't discover was actually her septum, her nostrils. And I was very keen to get this right, but there didn't seem, no matter how many hundreds of images I trawled through, it was very difficult to find an image of her. Then one day I was in a very large Boots the Chemists in Liverpool Street Station, and there, to my absolute joy, was a Rimmel, I remember it, a Rimmel advert of a taken of her at an angle, and you could see her nose perfectly. And I think I leapt with joy and started in an animated fashion taking photographs of this large advertising hoarding. And it was only a few moments later that I realized that most of the staff were looking at me as if I was clearly today's nutter in the shop. So from the sublime gold Kate Moss to the next commission, the very unusual gold bananas. These things always start with a phone call. I wasn't in the workshop, Dennis took it. And the next day when I came in, he said, "We've had the strangest request. A very earnest young woman has called asking whether we could make 4 gold bananas, 150 grams each, the exact weight of a gold banana, the exact weight of a real banana, in gold, actual size." It was, I remember, the last day of February, and they wanted these delivered before the end of the next month. So we had less than a month to get this commission made. We absolutely love this sort of thing. The more outrageous the challenge, the more likely we are to want to make it. So I made the phone call back to them and said, right, if this is going to work, your entire team is going to need to materialize in our workshop tomorrow morning. Everyone with the responsibility to both sign this off and pay for it will need to be there. And you will need to pay us the exact amount of all the gold up front if this is to work. And to their credit, they did it. This very young rainbow tribe of earnest young people appeared from Microsoft and explained that this was going to be the prize for the next Xbox game, the Sea of Thieves, a pirate game in which the currency were gold bananas. So they thought to launch the game, what better way than offering a quiz with a prize of gold bananas from the game. Off we went. You can see there in the second image to the right, a real banana on the workshop bench. We got through an awful lot of bananas in that month. We soon realized that bananas change shape and size very quickly. Within a day, they look different. Their skin texture looks different. Their profile changes. So every day we bought a new hand of bananas. We ate lots of bananas. It reminds me of the time we made a job for Hancock's, copying a piece that's in the Royal Collection. Sorry, we made it for Tessier's, copying a piece in the Royal Collection that Hancock's had reproduced for the Great Exhibition, of a clam shell with a crayfish. And we realized when we looked at it that the crayfish was clearly dead. And so we went down to Billingsgate Market and bought a basket of live crayfish. And clients to this day still remember coming into the workshop and finding crayfish crawling everywhere. Well, similarly, this month was the era of bananas everywhere. So there's Dennis hand filing and carving into boxwood, which is a wonderfully receptive wood, one of the formers that we were going to press in sheet gold. Again, the calculations were that to make these in actual size, we had the opposite problem that we had with Kate Moss. Our problem was that the gold was going to have to be very thin for it to weigh the same as a real banana. There's a very simple press tool. That's a steel face, and I don't know if you can see the polished edge to it. That's an exact polished radius to allow that piece of wood with a piece of metal inserted between it to be pushed down into the mold, so allowing us to make a three-dimensional form. And the beauty of this press tool was that by unscrewing that sheet of steel and turning it around to the other side, we could make both the left and right hand sides of the mold. There's an early test piece in silver, 0.5 millimeter thick, and the blue lines endlessly trying to work out the minimum amount of gold we would need to buy in order to make this. To the extreme right and the extreme left are the press tools for the stem of the banana. They were filed into steel, and those are the first test pressings in silver. One of the early things we needed to resolve was how we were going to get a hand of bananas that behaved like a hand of bananas. We calculated that the tear strength pulling a single banana from a hand was about 2 kilos. And we approached this wonderful firm in the Midlands who made Numidium magnets, these tiny but very strong magnets. We knew we literally had days to get these made, and they were completely unfazed. I think they were quite intrigued by the project. And I think within a week in the post, these perfect magnets arrived. We had to be absolutely certain constantly that we were getting the polarity right so that the bananas attracted each other and didn't repel each other. There on the piece of steel, you can see calculations, those blue lines. That's a piece of copper in Dennis's hand. We're working out how exactly, the smallest piece of gold, the smallest sheets of gold that we can buy. Buying gold in itself is now an issue. It probably always has been throughout history. There are very few stockholders who are going to hold large amounts of gold. We were very fortunate when we started in our careers that the big bullion dealers did hold stocks of gold, but their accountants soon worked out that it was cheaper for them to actually lease it and buy it direct from the manufacturers, which was always a nightmare for us because it meant that actually getting hold of the sufficient amount of gold could sometimes be difficult. So we saw some 3mm bead welds. Those beads are just over 0.5 millimeter large. We invested in yet another piece of welding equipment, a mini TIG welder, to enable us to do this very fine welding. And it worked perfectly. As you can see from the areas that have been cleaned up to either side, they're essentially virtually seamless. So to the left there are the collets in gold that were made to hold the magnets. This is a very ancient way of making gold tube. This is exactly the way tubing would be made in any hinged box. A sheet of gold or sheet of silver is taken, it's rounded up in this swage block that you see there that they're sitting into, which has different sized half-round depressions made in it. You put a steel bar inside and hammer into that, and you form it up into a tube. The point that looks rather like the tip of a quill pen is where that will then subsequently put into a draw bench, and that will be extruded through a hole in a steel plate until you produce the exact size of tubing you want. On the right there, I promise you'll never look at bananas the same way again. You may not have noticed, but at the end of a banana, at the other end from the stem, are these wonderful little florets, we ended up calling them. I could never find out their correct botanical name. But if you imagine a courgette with a courgette flower attached, well, this is where the flower would have been attached to the banana, which is effectively the seed host of the fruit. And they're very beautiful little things. We had those cast from life, and we welded those onto these rods, these little bars of gold, because again, the clients, the one insistence they had is that these bananas should weigh exactly 150 grams each. And so by welding them onto these bars, we knew that these would be the final pieces added to the bananas, and we could chip off, cut off, saw off parts of that bar until we achieved the absolutely correct weight. There they are, nearly finished. They really looked and felt like bananas. They were terrific fun. We textured them, we worked them. They really looked like bananas, and we were less concerned about security with these. So we did have visitors to the workshop who saw them, and everybody that picked them up were, in a childlike way, intrigued by them and desperately wanted one. And unlike the struck hallmarks on Cape Moss, here we are entering the modern world. Because the gold was so thin and because they're hollow, these had lasered hallmarks. And reading from left, that's Smith & Harris's maker's mark or sponsor's mark, DS, Dennis Smith and Gareth Harris. Then there's the crown, which denotes that this object is made of gold. 750 is the parts per 1,000 of pure gold in the alloy, and that's what we know as 18 karat gold. It's a perfect gold. It's hard wearing, it's strong, not quite as soft as 22 karat gold, but perfect for this sort of thing. And then the T is the date letter that's changed every year. The script and the shape of the shield is changed. So you can look up these marks going back 700 years. That's the T for 2018. Now, in explaining these hallmarks to a young American company, and I had no idea really what they were or what they meant, I think they were slightly intrigued that so much of other people's authorship was going to be embedded into their bananas. And they were very keen that their logo, that Xbox's logo, should be there too. So we approached the assay office. Now it's fairly common practice, you're allowed to add logos. In 2018 it wasn't, and we got the sort of special dispensation to add Xbox's logo. And no sooner had we got that than Rare, who are the developers of the game, decided they wanted their logo on it too. So that's a unique hallmark. I somehow doubt there'll ever be another hallmark with that collection of different marks on it. The very last thing to be done was to laser in the image from the game. This is a very cleverly made up image. It looks like a skull, but when looked at closely within that, the eyes became sailing ships. There's a pirate in there with a parrot on his shoulder. Quite an extraordinary thing, and not an easy thing to laser onto a curved surface. This was the very last thing done. We had worked unbelievable hours on this, day and night. We'd overcome quite extraordinary obstacles, technical issues, and we were absolutely thrilled. We had now reached Friday, and Microsoft was sending over a full film crew the next day on the Saturday to make a film in our workshop before they went back to Microsoft and were unveiled on the Monday. So we were at the absolute end of our time. And that was the day that the beast from the east blew in. I don't know if you can remember this, cast your minds back to March 2018, extraordinarily high winds, snow, Siberia even arrived in London on that day. And we got a phone call from the people doing the lasering to say, we're terribly sorry, but due to health and safety, we can't have our staff going home in this. We're sending everybody home. We won't be able to get to your job until Monday. I pleaded. I explained to them the sheer amount of work that we had gone to. And I even remember saying, where is it that the member of staff who does this lives? And they lived in Shoreditch. And I said, well, what if I offered to walk him home and ensure his safety? And I think at that point they realized how desperate we were to get this done. And they agreed that he could stay on and laser in this remarkable image into the bananas. And there they are finished. The final request from Microsoft was for evaluation. Well, we thought that was fairly straightforward. They're worth what you've paid for them. No, that wasn't good enough. They wanted an accredited valuation. So we went to the then quite newly formed Royal Society of Valuers and Assessors and asked them if they could, at very short notice, come and give an accredited valuation. And the valuer was absolutely astonished by these. He took copious notes. It was, of course, completely outside any area of reference, but he became particularly interested in the hallmark and the uniqueness of that and the uniqueness of the object. And liaising with one of his colleagues, they came up with a much higher valuation, almost twice the value that we had charged to make them for Microsoft. So Microsoft were absolutely delighted. There they are finished. And in just the same way as Siren, Gold Cape Moss, had doubled in value in the time we had made her because of the extraordinary rise in gold prices, so the gold bananas a decade later had doubled in value because of their unique nature. So in both cases, we ended up with very happy clients. And that's the end. Thank you very much for listening. And I do hope that's been of interest. I'm just going to run back through those images to probably the most beautiful one for me, the image of finished Siren. And thank you very much.
Gareth, thank you very much indeed. That was a fantastic talk, and I missed it first time around, and I'm absolutely thrilled to have had that and seen these extraordinary images. And I must say, the sort of, manhandling that figure around the workshop just is just sort of overwhelming. Now, we've got a lot of questions. Let me see. Now, would you, for choice, now weld rather than solder gold?
Yes, welding is wonderful because it's invisible. So it's actually changed the way we design things. Often with silver work or objects that we soldered, you would make a clear demarcation in the design. So say on the foot of an object, it would be clearly delineated as to what was the foot and what was the body, because you knew you had a seam there. But with welding, you don't need that. So some of our later work has become a lot more fluid. We made a loving cup for one of the craft guilds, which is much more, the foot flows up into the body, and there is that beautiful ability of creating a seamless join. You cannot do it everywhere, so it has its limitations. You really need to be able to do both, and I'm sure that will always be the case. But no, it has opened up an enormous new way of working for us that we're thrilled with.
Now, from Arthur, asking if there's a lot of difference between working in 18 carat and 22 carat, and he'd also like to know where the sculpture is now.
There is a lot of difference working in 18 carat and 22 carat. I mean, I suppose the first one is that 22 carat is significantly more expensive. It's a slightly different color, which is lovely. It does work if you're hammering it, if you're moving it about. It does work in a slightly easier way than 18 carat. Actually, fine gold is a beautiful material to work in, but it's not really suitable for anything that you'd use either as jewelry or in a domestic setting. So actually, for some of the jewelry we make, we use 22 carat gold, but 18 carat really is our preferred carat of gold. We don't use 9 carat gold at all and never have. There's more copper in it than gold. It came in as an emergency legislation to create wedding rings in the First World War. And I think it was only ever going to be a temporary alloy. And of course, it's never gone away because the trade lobbied to keep it because it's that much cheaper. But 18 carats are really robust gold to use. Where is Siren now? A small part of me hopes it's been melted down and has been remade into a lot of wedding rings. When it came back from the British Museum, sorry, when it left Goldsmiths Hall for the British Museum, and it was displayed in the Nereid Gallery. It was an utterly remarkable evening. Neil McGregor, the then director of the BM, made a very amusing speech about it, where he said that of all the works of art in the British Museum, this is the only one that is going up in value by the hour. Gold was still going up in price. We got it back when it was taken off show at the British Museum. They obviously applied some kind of rope or fabric hoist to one of the arms and marked it, just surface markings. So we got it back to put back into shape before it went off to the client that had purchased it. And even though it only took us a day to get it right, the insurance for that day was massive. And I remember saying to Mark, look, we won't charge you for this. But if it happens again, if this is going to happen regularly, if curators don't know how to handle, and how would they know how to handle a 50-kilo gold sculpture? By the way, it was also front heavy, so unless it was bolted down, she would laterally tip forward. So we said, if this happens in future, we will need to make a charge. And I always remember him saying to me, Gareth, you're never going to see it again, which I thought was an interesting thing to say. We met several people. People came to see it while we were making it. One of them was Mr. Sanyo, who had an idea of putting it in his garden. But each time one of these wealthy clients appeared, they normally came with a small entourage, and the look of horror on their on the women in the entourage's faces when they saw this rather provocative pose, and they would leave, and Dennis and I would look at each other and go, I don't think they'll be purchasing it. But anyway, it left our workshop in a flight case with the LAX prefix on it. So it went to Los Angeles. Whether it's there in somebody's garden, home, gallery, I have no idea. We've not seen it. In the same year that we made it, we made 4 other smaller 10-kilo versions, which actually are very beautiful. And I sincerely hope at least one of those survives into antiquity. And I think one of those has come onto the resale market since. And of course, because in a photograph you can't see the scale of it, when we saw that publicized, we immediately thought, oh, it's up for sale, it's up for sale. But it wasn't. It was the small version.
Right. Well, I think the idea of, I must say, I love the idea of the small version. It's sort of having that sitting on your desk or something. It's wonderful, and sort of about, you know, in a few hundred years' time, people sort of studying it and mulling it over is really intriguing. Gareth, again, thank you very, very much indeed. And this is really just to remind you that our next talk will be on Sunday, the 19th of July at 6:30, when the speaker will be Alice Minter, curator of the Rosalind and Arthur Gilbert collection at the V&A. And she will be talking about the Harash, Margas and Pantin families, the Huguenot refugees, and celebrated silversmiths. Thank you all very much for coming this evening, or joining us this evening. Thank you. Good night.
Thank you. Good night.